Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jayatri, Chief Bioscientist at the Franklin Institute. Thanks for joining me again for another conversation about the science behind the ongoing COVID pandemic. Now, I have some special guests with me today to bring in some other friends from the TFI science team. So joining me today are Dr. Rachel Valletta, who's our environmental scientist at the Franklin Institute, and of course, Derrick Pitts, our chief astronomer at the Franklin Institute. And I brought them here today because one crisis that we're all facing in the midst of this biological crisis is information overload. If you're like me, and hopefully one of the goals of our conversations as part of this Franklin at Home program is to help you make sense of all this information, but there's stuff coming out, not just day by day, but every hour. Twitter is exploding with information. Science is coming out faster than we have a chance to keep track of what the latest is. And so it's a good opportunity to take a step back and remind ourselves some of the best practices of information literacy. How do we make sense of all of this information? Because when it comes to this pandemic, there's a lot of confusing stuff out there. There are so many questions that are truly unanswered, whether it's the variation in symptoms from person to person, whether it's which model of the week is the most accurate, or how it's transmitted and how all of this relates to how long we stay in quarantine. There's a lot of uncertainty, and so trying to filter through information to decide what's important and what's accurate to make those decisions is more critical now than ever before. And this is a skill that's not restricted to talking about the pandemic. So my colleagues here have a lot of experience communicating in different areas of science. So we thought we'd put our heads together today to come up with some best practices across our different fields that you can apply to all of the news that you're seeing today, but really also develop those skills and train other people, your friends and family and students, to apply these critical thinking skills as well. So I think what we're seeing today with COVID-19 in particular is that the information that might lead us astray generally falls into what I'm seeing as kind of two different categories of information. There's one category that I think of as kind of hot information. And then there's a separate category that I see as bad information. And so Rachel and Derrick, I want to talk about the distinction between these two and some of the trends across science that go along with these different types of information. So let's talk about the hot information first. Mm-hmm. So I'll ask you guys, what are some observations, that you're seeing as scientists outside biology as the news is coming out fast and furious? How does it feel to you as scientists, but maybe, looking in with a different lens?
Wow. Well, for me, in this particular instance of COVID-19, even with the training that I've had, the experience I've had, this still feels like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much material coming out, and it's almost as if there are a number of different hoses all throwing material at me, and it's a challenge to try to figure out which streams are which. So that's for COVID-19, okay? Now, if I think about astronomy, there are a number of different instances in astronomy where we have this kind of hot information that comes across. And it most often happens in events in astronomy that are meant for the general public to observe, okay? So that's one kind of hot piece of information. A good example of that is most recently the supermoon phenomenon, where we want everybody to go out and look at how big the moon is going to be on this particular night. But if you don't do any digging, you'll think that only happens, once every blue moon, so to speak. But it happens more often than that under certain kinds of situations if you just did a little bit of digging. The other one that's really good is meteor showers. This is
yeah. Everybody's like, should I go out in my backyard at 2 a.m.?
Exactly, right. And as it turns out, there are about 14 meteor showers during the course of the year, of which two too are really worth spending time seeing. But we find on the news that it's often reported that even the minor meteor showers are exciting to go outside and see nature's fireworks. Yeah, okay, okay. And
So
then
we're
the
gonna pause
last,
for a second there,
yeah?
and oh no, okay, go ahead. Give a third example. Yes.
No, no, I was just going to say the one last thing is that every month in astronomy, it seems as if there's a new superlative that's being
Yeah.
thrown out there for distance, for size, or for age. But what happens is most of the stories always ignore the significance in terms of discovery and how the details of that particular discovery fit into the overall story of science. So those are the three things that happen most often in astronomy with hot information.
Right, and I think those examples get to a broader trend that we're seeing this media landscape of interpretation of information without necessarily its full context, right? So when it comes
Exactly.
to, for instance, for COVID, I think one of the things we've commented on, our conversations before, is that science is moving faster than we've ever seen before. Like everybody is motivated to do the research, to find insights, but it's faster than the normal process of peer review and publication. And even some of the ones that are peer reviewed are going through peer review so quickly that there's some questions about the quality of peer review.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we're seeing, and then because people are so hungry for information, these get this, somewhat, either preliminary or ambiguous information gets boiled down into, these headlines that then become overly confident, like, oh, the virus is mutating into different strains.
Yeah.
Oh, let's
Yeah.
take a step back. The virus
Yes.
is changing, but that's different from what it means to be a different strain. Or, whether it's the results of early clinical trials or the number of people who have been infected, we're seeing some of these problems that are baked into science that's sometimes being done sloppy or
Mm-hmm.
sometimes just too early, and we lose that context.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just mention really
Yeah.
quickly is that that context thing I think is really important because often the context is a much larger picture than is being presented in this little piece of information that's coming at you. Just as you say, Jayatri, that really can make a mess of things sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. We're sort of in, there's parallel stories here happening in my mind, because on the one hand, as we're rushing this scientific information to print or preprint in this case, we're sort of seeing a democratization of science almost, right? Which is a good thing, and I think we've been seeing that called for quite a long time now. So it's great that people have access to information as it's coming out, but as you say, without that scientific expertise, how can they possibly interpret it? I also wonder if, if we take a step back and we sort of see science journalism as a broader, this is a product perhaps of a broader systemic issue within science journalism, that we don't have all of the science journalists with the proper skill sets to be able to work through that information as quickly as it's coming out, to properly filter it, to properly contextualize it, and push it out to a public audience.
That's right, because I mean, one of the challenges that we've seen here is that, when it comes to this pandemic, there are so many different fields of science that it's impossible for somebody to be an expert in all of them.
Right. And, it's funny because sometimes we see armchair experts, and these can be scientists themselves, right, that have perhaps a PhD or specialization in one narrow field of science, but have applied it now to just trying to understand the spread of COVID, to trying to use these public health models. But of course, expertise in one field doesn't make us geniuses in all other fields. It's kind of akin to, me suggesting that I can proselytize on astrophysics because I have a degree in earth science. Of course, we know that's not the case. So yeah, major communication challenges here for sure.
But I think, just to talk about some of the opportunity too that you mentioned, that because of this interdisciplinary nature, we're seeing new collaborations between different fields of science that have not always worked together. And I think that's the exciting opportunity. And how do we elevate the outcomes of those collaborative, synergistic research being done, while still keeping a skeptical eye on stuff that's just coming out before it has a chance to be contextualized and vetted.
Yeah. Is there a particular case study that comes to mind that you think is sort of a resounding success here?
I think one of the most interesting stories that I've been following is the work of the Seattle flu study.
Say
So
more.
this is an interdisciplinary group of scientists, it's based in Seattle, that have been looking at epidemiology and virology and statistics and evolution to really get a good picture of when the virus first started spreading in Seattle, who got infected, how do you look for it when retroactively when you might not have expected it to be there. How can you predict what's changing? And then how do you design good, solid statistical sampling techniques to get an accurate picture of where it is? And so, they got a lot of attention because they actually kind of violated the rules of, shall we say, of the way that science has been typically done. Because they found the first traces of COVID in patients that they had been sampling for the flu. Mm-hmm. And according to the rules by which science is done, when you work with human subjects, you have to outline very carefully what you plan to do with the data and why you're collecting that data. And there are very, very good reasons for doing this. And so they had a large-scale study out to look for the flu and patterns in the flu. And when they heard about COVID, they wanted to go back into their flu data to look for traces of coronavirus. And technically, this was an ethical violation of how they had set up the terms of the study. But they decided that this was a public health emergency and that this justified this other use of the data. And that's how they were able to find the earliest case of coronavirus in the Seattle area. And that informed certainly how they managed it. And so I think that's a really interesting case study of where, we're not doing science necessarily by the book, because people, are working collectively and have decided that the stakes are too high. But of course, when is it okay to push those boundaries, and when does that violate, what most people would agree are the norms of science? And so that then gets, interpreted again in the media. But it's a really interesting story, and if I would definitely recommend reading about the work that the Seattle flu study is doing.
Sure.
I've thought of another example in a much sort of a different scale, if you will, but similar to this in that the way in which NASA has been organizing research teams around the world to look for life elsewhere in our solar system. Now, very simply, the major thread of the work that's being done is to track to see where there is water in the solar system, water being the basis for the development of life as we know it. So if you look at how this science has been pursued, everybody has been working to the goal of identifying environments that might have been conducive to the existence of water, that may have developed some of the chemical components for the building blocks of life. Not necessarily looking for aliens or looking for microbes, but simply trying to start with the basic building blocks to establish environments that might be conducive. Now, in that, what I've seen is that these researchers have been extraordinarily careful about their claims about what they've been saying they are actually doing and what the results actually are and what the results mean. No one has come out to say that the results of any of their work has indicated the existence of life at any point, anywhere yet. The goal might be that, but in the meantime, this is what we have to work with. We're going to go straight down this line and be very careful not to deviate. And there's a very good reason for that. The hype that comes from talking about finding life elsewhere can easily be misinterpreted in a broader scale in the public. So I think this is a good example of how they've used restraint to help just channel things properly and do their best to tell this story as cleanly as they possibly can.
So that's a great setup for a question that we've gotten coming in. So how do you determine what's real and what's not? And we're going to come around to some concrete strategies a little bit later. But I think, Derrick, what the point that you just made is the caveats and the humility that you see being presented along with the results.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's really important that that when you're thinking about all these different kinds of things, you know, you have to figure out what questions you really have to ask, how you set the scenario for what's happening, so that you're clearly heading for one thing while weeding out everything else that can cause confusion in an issue. And so those kinds of things really make a big difference if you can make sure you pay very close attention to those. So again, the story doesn't get confused about what it is you think you're trying to do. And the other piece of this is, what kind of confidence do you have in what it is you're working with? And often that confidence can be provided if you seek out corroboration by other experts. Look around the rest of the field to see who else is saying what and how many people are going in the same direction.
Right. Looking at trends across the field
Yes,
as opposed
exactly.
to any one expert. And so that's another good question here is, how do you distinguish between studies that are done unethically for the right reasons and those that aren't? Yeah, this is a tricky one. So let me give you a little bit of insight especially in the medical and biological research, where you are often dealing with human subjects with potentially sensitive information. There are guidelines that are now put in place to protect the rights and protect human subjects from coming to any harm. And the standard process is that any study that's done gets reviewed by what we call an institutional review board. And that typically consists of scientists, other experts, who can evaluate the validity of the research, the benefit of the research, and the potential risks to the participants. What's interesting and is that there are also two knowledgeable community members who also serve on those committees. So, in my role as a museum scientist, I've had the opportunity to sit on similar committees before. So that's the standard process, that all of that kind of review has to be in place before a study can proceed. Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, we should add that that process is particularly stringent and often takes many, many months and sometimes longer than that. So as the scientist on the research back-end side of things, can be often very frustrating barriers for us to overcome because they slow the process down so much. But they are intended to create that stopgap and to really take the researchers and the proposed research process to task to ensure that safety. And for good reason. You've talked a bit, Jayatri, about some historical hiccups that have happened in the absence of those restraints in the past. So we should add that is a built-in feature and not a bug of the process.
Right, it's meant to be a safeguard, right? But when we're in the middle of an emergency, when can we speed that up? And I don't know that we have the answer yet. That can we have emergency reviews? Who is on those panels? Who decides? And it should never be a single person. Ideally, and yet sometimes in hindsight, it's 2020, you think, oh, that was worth it, but it was a risk that they took. And yeah, these are really sticky ethical questions. I don't think we have the answers to them.
No.
But I think it's something for science as a field to think about, is that knowing that these safeguards are in place for very good reasons, how do we speed up the process when we need to? But okay, before we move on to thinking about bad information, we have one other question to discuss here. What do you think of people that take publicly available data and use the tools in engineering and marketing to forecast where this pandemic is going and then publish it to social media?
I think it depends on what the impetus is. One of the challenges here that I struggle with is there are a lot of very intelligent, well-meaning folks out there that are interested in saying something interesting, saying something helpful. I think in the case of the recent pandemic, there's we talked about that fire hose already. I think we have to really ask ourselves very, very critically, is there a space for this? Like, does this actually save someone's life? I mean, that's really what we're coming down to here. And I think that's a very sobering question, and we should probably put that restraint on ourselves. So yeah, for all the armchair experts out there, maybe we turn instead to the experts here and the epidemiologists here for that source of information. And if we can be of use to them, in service of them, I think that's where potentially we can play a role.
I think that's right. It comes back to the collaboration, because absolutely, so much about public health is around communication and social norms, and these all of these variables that we look at in the models of whether it's percent of people infected or tested or death rate. There's so much that goes into the variability in that we have agency over. That I think it's really important to look at insights from marketing and statistics. I think the question is, are they doing it in a vacuum, or are they consulting with the epidemiologists who are generating the data and coming to a collaborative conclusion?
I thought of an analogy just now that's come to mind that hopefully works. I'll try and see how it works out. Years ago, people who owned automobiles took great pride in understanding how the automobile worked and understood intricately a lot of the internal parts of the engines and things like that, and could repair them without too much difficulty. Nowadays, we purchase cars without knowing very much about the mechanics at all, and we're dependent upon the automotive industry to have taken care of all those little problems so that we no longer have to deal with it. So if something fails, we just take it to a service center and it's fixed. And so my analogy here, I think, is trying to get at the idea that, yes, there are people who want to put information out, and how are they seeking to do that? I think part of that requires some agency on our part to help people understand how the mechanisms work, so that we do see, and we can put players in the right positions to either provide additional information or to support the epidemiological report, researchers and others who are actually doing the real work and are much closer to it. So I'd like to put a vote in for somehow seeing to it that we better understand how the engine works.
I like that analogy. I'm on board.
I think, there's a role, we're talking in part to a public audience here and in part to a science researcher audience.
Right, yeah.
And I think that there's a lot that can be taken from what we've just hit on, but specifically for a public audience, I think some of the best ways to show your trust in epidemiologists and to show your trust in public health officials is to listen to their recommendations. I think that we can't overstate the power of, for example, wearing a mask out in public. There's a lot of questions about their efficacy, but we know that they're probably not causing harm, and so put one on, right? And I think that showing that public trust, we really can't overstate the value in that enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting we all become shade tree mechanics. I just want to know, I just think we should know exactly what the mechanic is doing. I think that it's our responsibility to have that trust in the mechanic.
And I think that's where we see, specifically us.
Exactly.
The faces you're seeing on your screen right now.
That's us.
We are here to help, right?
While acknowledging that it's difficult to understand the engine and to study a given scientific problem, and again, even if you're a trained scientist, it doesn't make you an expert in every science field. So those are all great points. So come back and talk with us.
We just got a question from somebody who is giving us the perfect segue to move on to the other type of information that we're facing. So the question here is, how do you talk to people who are skeptical of leaders in science and prefer to look to the internet for answers? And there's I think that comes from this same sentiment of wanting to know for yourself, where the information is coming from and where the guidance is coming from. And that brings us to our second category of information that's hard to distill, which is what I'm calling bad information. So, well, our first category, just to distinguish these two a little bit more, is, when we think about hot information, it's information that is, really done in the best interests of science, but isn't always communicated in the best way. How that differs from bad information is that bad information is put out there to be deliberately misleading. So there's this intent to mislead. And when you're the kind of person who wants to go and read for yourself, but you don't have expertise in it, it can be difficult to distinguish between what's accurate information, what's hot information, what's bad information. And what's challenging in particular with particular areas of science is that there are bad actors out there who specifically want to manipulate science for politics or profit, whether it's skepticism about vaccines or this theory that it's COVID is somehow related to 5G or what have you. I think, Rachel, you can speak to this a little bit from some of the climate communication work that you've done.
Yeah, there's certainly plenty maleficent actors in the climate space, and as you say, exacerbating uncertainties and unknowns within the climate science space to suggest that climate scientists are a part of some global conspiratorial grouping. So there's certainly a lot of bad folks working in this space. I think that in order to spot some of that, though, I think there does need to be, I think having a healthy level of skepticism is appropriate. And in fact, I think in science research, that's appropriate. And we want to make sure that we're, again, taking to task those scientific questions. And we should say also that some of these anxieties around mistrust can be appropriate. They're not necessarily misplaced. It's what you do with that anxiety that does matter. So in the case of climate communication, we know that there are good ways to go ahead and talk about climate science, even though we're working within this politicized space. And so the strategies that we often use, we talk about climate in a local, relevant, and solutions-focused way. We make sure as climate communicators, and for those climate scientists out there, you want to make sure that you're talking about the local climate science impacts. You want to make sure that you're talking about how they're relevant with your audience, so making that personal connection with whomever you're chatting with. And you want to make sure that you're turning to a solution after that. I think where that analogy breaks down in the case of COVID is we don't necessarily have those solutions there yet, right? Like the ultimate solution might be having a vaccine. And so it's a little bit perhaps too easy to use the local relevant solutions focused framework for solving issues around COVID. I think one of the challenges in communicating the immediacy and the threat of climate change is that it is somewhat slow moving. Often we perceive it as a problem deep into the future. We know it's a problem now, but often we perceive it's going to be a bigger problem for my children or grandchildren. In the case of COVID, however, we're seeing those immediate threats right here, right now. This is something that I could go out and contract. This is something I can spread to my immediate family members, and we could be severely impacted in the immediate future. And so in some ways, talking about this particular threat is made easier because of the condensed timeline that the disease plays out.
But I think if I were to interpret your strategies a little more loosely, to think about how do you talk to people who are skeptical, I think the local one is right on, right? Because certainly with any kind of an epidemic, the spread is based on geography, and this is why it is important to have local science communication, because the context in which you're talking about COVID in Philadelphia is very different from the context that people are seeing around them in a more rural part of the state.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's huge, and we'll get in a little bit to some of the tools that we can use to identify sort of logical fallacies that are used, whether it's in climate spaces or in any other sort of bunk science communication. I think the next term there, though, relevance, is one that also might be a little bit tricky, and often we think that if it's not something that's immediately impacting me or my family, then it's not a problem, right? So the opposite can happen. If we don't feel it's a threat to our family, then we don't feel we need to react quickly. But I think the relevant part comes in when we're thinking more systemically and maybe more community minded, recognizing that I might not be experiencing negative impacts from this particular virus, but I could transmit that to someone else that could then. And so thinking a little bit more holistically, thinking more community minded might sort of help up the ante on that relevance bit.
Yeah, I want to, and there's another question that came in that I want to work in here. Do we think that COVID-19 is more of a political problem than being a healthcare problem right now? And I think that gets to this idea of solutions focused. That, I think in the early days of the quarantine, everybody understood that the actions that we were taking were to buy time to develop some of these more systemic solutions. And the problem, of course, is that the systemic solutions are harder to predict, when they're going to be ready. And so, there's a psychological issue there as well as a political issue. It's all tied together. I don't think you can separate them out. But we're seeing, we saw some early results from of vaccine trials coming out in the news today. So with all the caveats of the hot information that we just talked about, I think as the science progresses, hopefully science will be able to present some solutions. But we have to keep reminding people that the actions that, like wearing a mask, like, staying out of crowded places, like those are solutions too.
Yeah, and they don't, their importance is not diluted with time. I think that's another interesting thing. We lose the feeling of a threat, or we lose the feeling of relevance the further we get away from hearing a piece of information. But, that's another way that a public audience can help sort of instill some of that trust in the epidemiologists, the public health experts out there. It's reminding ourselves that the efficacy of a mask, whether it's really, really good or somewhere in the middle, it's still there. It has not changed with time. So that's another intriguing sort of mental tick that happens. We just very, very naturally, it's called recall bias. It's very easy for us to recall information that we've read recently, and we also place more importance on it. But just because an important fact was learned some time ago does not mean, of course, that its importance has lessened in some way.
Right. And I think those biases here, is we have a comment that, I feel like there's a lot of fear mongering too, that people who don't have a medical background are spreading their stress. And it's because we are all very anxious of so much uncertainty, for fear for our own personal health, for our family's health, that those biases, that stem from anxiety and stress are even more heightened than they might be.
And that, that spread of information too, I think we need to ask, why are we spreading that information? I think it's a very natural response for the average person to share their stressors with their trusted circle. But of course, some actors maybe have a targeted purpose for why they're spreading that fear mongering, as the question asker brought up. But I think that brings us actually, Jayatri, maybe to the next portion very well.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate one last thing, but as we get into some strategies that you can use and you can share. One is, again, to distinguish between the intention of who's sharing it with you and the intention of who might be the creator. Because just because some bad information is created by somebody with ulterior motives doesn't necessarily mean that the person who's sharing it on their social media feed shares those same bad intentions. And so when we have conversations about this, especially, we are the best, each one of us is the best science communicator for the people who trust us, that keep those intentions in mind. And I think that's always the best place to start that conversation, is where do you have those shared values? Where do you have common goals that you care about? And then you can apply, some strategies that we can get into.
Yeah, you did actually bring up, I don't want to have the final word here, but you did bring up another bias that we have, and it's that we sort of will willfully trust information from folks within our trusted circles without questioning the information itself. So if you, Jayatri, or you, Derrick, shared the same piece of information versus someone I'm very, very opposed to, I might trust it from you folks, but question it from someone else. So this is another role, as you say, we're our own best science communicators for those in our trusted circles, taking on that responsibility and really recognizing that we need to vet information that maybe looks a little bit questionable. Oh, Derrick, I think you're muted.
And that particular point can play a huge role depending on who that trusted source is, or who that circle is. And we do have to be very careful about who those people are and who it is that's bringing us that information. I've seen it happen a million times where someone presents some content that is deemed by a particular group to have great value, when in fact the truth behind it is not very stable at all. And that particular group takes that information and then unwittingly then shares that information even wider through their individual circle. So it can really be a serious consideration as to who that trusted source is.
Yeah. So that's a perfect segue into giving everybody some strategies for critical thinking and evaluating information. What's great is that there's a whole field of research in communication and psychology that's been studying how people make sense of information, where their biases are, and how to break through, when you're presenting somebody with information that might go against what their natural inclinations might be. And one of my favorites, just because it's a great acronym, was developed by an education professor named Dr. Julie Coiro at the University of Rhode Island and her colleagues. And it's so easy to remember because the acronym is SCAM. So let's walk through what each of these strategies mean. So the first one is the source. And this is what we've been talking about. Thinking about when you read a piece of information, who's the author? What expertise do they have? Do they have some kind of conflict of interest? And especially when it comes to biomedical stuff, are they selling something, or what other organization might they represent? Making sure that you're aware as to whether their scientific expertise matches the area that they're talking about. And again, this is especially important in coronavirus research for all of the reasons that we've been talking about, is that there may be good reasons for somebody outside the field to weigh in, but let's make sure that they're working with people who have that direct expertise.
Okay, so I can jump in with the second one here. There we are. Thank you very much. C for claim. What is the claim that's being made in this particular instance of the phenomenon? And can you find corroboration about this claim among other experts? Is there a trend that can be followed, that can easily be seen and followed? And in that claim, what are the appropriate caveats that can be applied to this? And what kind of level of confidence can be applied to this also? Again, by corroborating, finding out what the corroboration is by other experts in the field, and is there a trend for all this going in the right direction? There are many, many, many claims that can be made easily about some particular thing that's happening, but unless you start to ask those right questions again, then you might end up in a situation where you followed a claim, but it's not really what it should be. Again, my favorite example of this right now is the supermoon thing, where there's this claim about the moon being a certain size, or the largest it can ever appear on this particular day. If you chase that out a little bit further and actually speak to a number of other experts, you'll find that there are all sorts of other mitigating instances that can provide additional opportunities for this to happen. So while it's, again, this in astronomy is benign, but while you might miss the event on that specific day, you can certainly catch something extraordinarily close to that 24 to 36 to 48 hours later, if you just do things in the right way. There are lots of other ways for that to happen.
And I think what we see here with COVID is that there are consequences
Yes,
of,
and that's
you know,
that's the really
of false
important thing.
claims.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah.
And you know, the one thing that we know is there's a lot that we don't know.
Yeah.
And if you know, if you're seeing something where a claim is stated with, you know, a degree of certainty that doesn't come with a lot of humility around it, then you know, that's something to be skeptical of.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. So the next letter in there is A. And Jayatri, I see your scam and I raise you a flick.
Oh,
So as Jayatri mentioned, SCAM is just one framework that we can use, of course, and we can use other frameworks to bolster the strength of that. So the next A in SCAM stands for argument, and it's a little bit like the previous C for claim, but for the argument, I brought along a framework with me that was actually developed to help understand if we're looking at a denialist's argument. So in addition to analyzing the claim that's being proffered, we should really be trying to understand the framing of the argument that our source is providing. And so the FLIC method is one quick way to remember or one little acronym that we have here to help understand if it is a science denial claim. And we should mention that this was developed by John Cook, he's a professor at George Mason University, and it was developed again for climate denialist arguments, but it has been used very, very widely in a variety of science communication fields. And all of these 5 techniques that I'm going to talk about within the FLIC acronym have been used both within the vaccine space, anti-vaxxer arguments, certainly within climate, and in other fields as well. So it's not just those claims in climate communication. So FLIC, F-L-I-C-C, so the first F stands for fake experts. And this is a little bit like our S for scam, understanding the source. Very specifically, a denialist claim often props up fake experts. So this is the idea of the appeal to sort of a false authority. So again, we mentioned earlier, just because you have a PhD doesn't make you an expert in every tiny little nook and cranny of science. We've seen this a lot in the climate science space. We also want to make sure that we're not looking to sort of politicized or otherwise sort of dark money supported groups that do very specifically put out disinformation campaigns. We know that sounds conspiratorial, but we actually see quite well documented evidence for this happening, certainly proposing that climate change is a farce, or in the case of vaccines, that vaccines are a farce. These are well documented and they are indeed problematic. Fake experts can also be, one technique that can be used here is lifting up minority voices as well. And when I say minority voices there, I mean the percentage of consensus. So in the case of climate science, for example, we see somewhere on the order of 97% of climate scientists acknowledge that climate change is human caused and getting worse. So that means about 3%, maybe even less, are suggesting that climate change is not human caused. So we know in the real world that 97% far outweighs 3%. So let's let that extend into understanding science information as well. So the L then stands for logical fallacies, and we could spend all afternoon with this, but I won't bore you with it. And these are essentially argumentative non sequiturs. It's coming to a conclusion that's made illogically from the argument's premise. And many examples of these, as I say, perhaps could be an attempt to misrepresent or oversimplify scientific arguments. It could be undercutting a scientist's credibility by attacking their character rather than their scientific research or their scientific argument. And it might also be exploiting ambiguity of certain science terminology. So there are some terms that have a meaning within science and a meaning within common language. Often a term that we use here is uncertainty. Within scientific research, we know that uncertainty is a range of possible values. And the real, or the accurate value rather, is somewhere within that range.
It has a very specific statistical definition.
It is a specific statistical definition, yes. But we also know, of course, that we use that in common conversation as well. And when we use it in common conversation, it means we're unsure about something, or we're unsure about a person, or we're unsure about a decision. So sometimes these fake experts can sort of exacerbate that dual meaning to cause confusion. So that can be a problem as well. The I in FLIC stands for impossible expectations. So this is demanding unrealistic or unattainable standards of scientific proof. And it's, again, it's exploiting the probabilistic nature of science. So often, again, we present answers within a range of certainty. almost always within science, it is the case that there is no singular answer. It's often not yes or no. Much, much more commonly, there's a range of possible answers.
And you're often trying to disprove a hypothesis rather than prove something.
Yes, thank you.
Right.
You have to stop my role here. I really could cruise on. I love this stuff. So wrapping up with the final two C's then. The first C stands for cherry picking. We all have seen that happen. Derrick, you talked about it earlier with folks picking out certain astrophysical phenomena as particularly special. They might not actually be, right? And this is focusing on a particular subset of data rather than interpreting the data set as a whole. We've also seen this most recently, actually, Jayatri, within COVID cases. Some states and some areas within states choosing to reopen businesses based on overall trends in the US of COVID cases. And while we're seeing in some states that COVID cases are slowing or even starting to reduce, they're actually ramping up in other states. So those states that are seeing those ramping up values should not be looking, to this case, to cherry-picked data from other areas where we're seeing a slow or a reversal of those cases. So cherry picking can have a very immediate threat as well. And then finally, C, my favorite, conspiracy theories. Again, this is something that we're all pretty intuitively familiar with, this idea that there are a giant grouping of climate scientists that are all out there pushing some narrative, some with ulterior motive. It's kind of lunacy. But again, this idea that there's some secret plan with nefarious means.
I think what is is changing the conversation with respect to COVID is that ultimately, like, we can't control the virus.
Right.
The virus is a scientific crisis that will run its course, no matter what kind of theories we want to spin. And so there's a reality check here that will be very, very apparent.
Sure. Yeah. And just to wrap that up, there's a lot of information that we've been throwing at you folks, but I think what it goes to show is that to be resilient to misinformation, it really does take practicing in vigilance. And one way to improve your ability to spot these logical fallacies and these fake experts is to put the time in, to put the work in. And I think it's worth recognizing that is challenging, but it's worth it. And I think that's one thing that we can help contribute to the conversation. Yeah. So that wraps up the A for argument.
The perfect transition to the M, which is, okay, so you've looked at your source, you've read the claim, you've dissected the arguments. Now it's time to make a decision as to whether this is a valid argument or not, whether to trust this information. And before you can finally make that judgment, you have to question yourself too. Is that another aspect of cognitive biases is that we tend to trust information that supports what we already think. And I dove into this in a little bit more detail with Annie Duke, who's a decision strategist, a couple of weeks ago. So if this is something that's interesting to you, I encourage you to go check out my conversation with her. But if you're reading something that supports something that you already believe, be extra critical and just go take that extra step before you make that decision. As to whether this is something to really trust. But I want to wrap up by kind of tying together some of these threads that we've talked about. One is, take a break. These discoveries that are coming out day by day, ultimately they're going to create a pattern that we'll only be able to understand the full story over time. And so you don't have to follow the headlines every single day and evaluate every piece of information. Look for those articles that try to take a broader view of trends that are emerging, rather than try and evaluate every single thing that comes up. The other piece is I do want to encourage you to apply these strategies yourself, and feel empowered to communicate this to your circle of friends and family. As we've talked about before in this conversation, that the people trust you, and so the better that you're able to evaluate scientific information, you have that relationship with them where then they will trust you. So don't be afraid to talk about this stuff. Again, this is a situation where people's lives depend on it. And so we hope that, by joining us in conversations like this, or, any of the programming that we do, another important aspect is that, your ability to talk about science doesn't have to be just about COVID. If you share a general curiosity about science, whether it's the environment, whether it's astronomy, I hope that what our conversation today has shown is that this process of science is shared among all fields, and by just nurturing your curiosity and your about all of these will improve your ability to focus on any one thing. And so I want to close with two quick check-ins. One is that today is International Museum Day. Hooray for museums! And hopefully, this is a day to just reflect for us. It's to reflect on the role that that we can play in helping our community make sense of it. And we hope that you've been joining us for some of our Franklin at Home programs that help us continue our mission of inspiring a passion for science and technology, even when our doors are closed. And so, if you're able, please consider donating to the Franklin Institute if that's something that you'd like to do. We're always grateful for everyone's support, and you can visit our website at www.fi.edu to contribute. And we couldn't do this without you. And finally, speaking of taking a break, next Monday is Memorial Day, so we are going to take a break from our conversations about COVID-19. We hope you have an opportunity to enjoy the long weekend. I'm sure that by the time we're back here in 2 weeks, there will be a lot to talk about. So I will look forward to joining you again in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, read the news with a critical eye. Rachel and Derrick, thank you so much for joining me today as well. And we'll close just with a reminder of our great strategies. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.